Now, everyone says that there's no divorce in the Catholic Church, but really, annulments sound a lot like divorce. So to help us understand this a little better, I am now joined by Father Alex Laschuk of the Marriage Tribunal of the Archdiocese of Toronto. Father Alex, welcome again.
Glad to be here.
So maybe we should look at, so you work at the Marriage Tribunal. We've already spoken about marriage and what marriage is. What is marriage? What makes marriage valid? Just quickly tell us.
Well, basically, a valid marriage is one that's contracted according to Catholic form, so that you're in the church in front of a designated minister. So that's the aspect of form. The other one is consent, that your consent is made knowingly and freely, and that you intend what the church intends. And then finally, that there's no impediment. So those would be the three things: consent, impediment, and form.
And form. Yeah. Okay, so then at the Marriage Tribunal, you're looking at not necessarily you are looking at dissolving marriages, but I guess that's another question. What's the difference then? So what's an annulment? Looking at the nullity.
Yeah, so an annulment, a declaration of nullity is probably a better word, is to say that there was a problem from the very beginning. And so we can look at a question of consent. You know, was there a problem with your consent from the beginning? Did you maybe not make that freely? Did you intend something that was not what the church intended? Or perhaps was there an impediment from the beginning? So we dump into the documentary process to establish whether there was an impediment, which means that at the time you couldn't enter into a marriage, or was there a problem of form? So it could be lack of form, which is very easy. I'm a Catholic who got married at City Hall. Or a defect of form could be there was another problem that, for example, I'm a Catholic, I got married at the parish, but the priest wasn't properly delegated to do the wedding.
Right.
I had a visiting priest come in from another diocese. He didn't bother to get faculties.
So that would be lack of form.
Defect of form, that one.
Okay.
Because it seems like there's a form, whereas there's lack of form is there's not even a semblance of form. You know, City Hall or, I don't know, the synagogue or...
So lack of form basically means whether it took place outside of the Catholic Church or the rite was not done properly?
Yeah, and say there's no minister, there's no rite, nothing.
Right, okay.
Whereas a defect of form, that there was something, but there was something not there. Something was
lacking.
Not
there. Maybe those can be fixed rather than
They could be. Well, usually when they come to us, the reason we would figure it out is because there has been a breakdown and now we're looking through this.
They want to
maybe
separate.
Get remarried or something, or become Catholic sometimes.
Okay, so is it fair to say that basically an annulment is saying that declaring that the marriage was not valid in the first place?
Yeah, basically, exactly. That we're saying that from the beginning that there was something missing here. Yeah.
From the beginning. So that means that at the time of consent, so like on their wedding day, either they didn't, the three promises, freedom, fidelity, or exclusivity, whatever the promises are, open to children, either they misunderstood those or they lied.
They lied, maybe, or maybe they weren't of sufficient freedom to make that.
Okay.
Or of a maturity, you know, you need to have a certain maturity.
Right.
So we try and look at those facts and what can we figure out about that time.
Okay. Let's look at the question of maturity, because I know here in the Archdiocese of Toronto, and I don't know if that's an archdiocesan thing or if it's like a provincial thing, that you have to be 21 or 18?
18 is a civil law in Ontario, or else younger than that you need your parents' permission.
Can the bishop say that we will not marry anybody until they're older?
Generally not, just because, again, people have a right to marry. And I mean, really strictly, if you had a 17-year-old who really wanted to marry, I mean, I think she would have a case to get a dispensation from that.
Because canon law says that if they're 16, they can.
Some are more
mature. But they would need a
others.
dispensation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's particular law actually from the CCCB that we would respect the civil law. And canon law tells us to follow the civil law of the country we're in. And some countries that might be 21 in the Middle East or different places like that.
Okay, it could be. So that's not necessarily a case for nullity.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so declaring a marriage invalid means that you're annulling?
Well, we're just declaring a juridic fact, basically, that we're just declaring through a judicial procedure that there never was a marriage. Yeah, so we're not erasing something that was there. It was never there, and we've looked at the facts, we've looked at the law and the evidence, and we're saying it was not there.
Erasing that there was never a marriage, or that there was never a valid marriage?
It was never a valid marriage, yeah.
In the Catholic Church?
In the Catholic Church. Probably it was civilly valid, most likely.
Okay. Now, you mentioned impediments. Yes. So explain that.
Well, basically, there are certain things, just like in civil law, that if they exist, then we can't have a valid marriage. For example, a deacon can't go to the parish and get married to a young lady walking down the street. He has an impediment of sacred orders.
Right.
Or a nun can't go because she has impediment. It could be that you've been kidnapped by someone, so there's an impediment of abduction. Some are natural law impediments, which means they can't be dispensed from. So, for example, if you're impotent, that you can't contract validly a marriage. Some could be are more ecclesiastical law. So, for example, can you marry your first cousin or not? And those kinds of questions. So, for some of those things, there can be dispensations granted. Or even for marrying a priest not being able to get married after ordination, the Holy Father can grant a dispensation. People leave ministry and do get married. Or sometimes even deacons remain in ministry and are given permission to remarry, but they would need a dispensation for that.
Okay, so you mentioned the relations, the cousin, first cousin. How often does that happen?
Not too often in this part of the world, but in a place like Toronto, people have been married in other parts of the world. And especially when we're talking about the Middle East, we're talking about closed communities where there's a lot more of marrying of different degrees of cousins, I'd say. Second cousins, three cousins, third cousins, just because they're small communities, you know, in Iraq or places like this. And so sometimes we do have to look at this, were the dispensations granted that were required? So we could have consanguinity, which is a blood relation, or affinity is when you could have like in-laws and that kind of thing. And this can differ also if you're a Latin Catholic or an Eastern Catholic.
And what about adoption? Like,
also the adoption creates rules, which is why we can get propriety, public propriety. So basically if I'm cohabitating with a woman and she has a daughter, that basically that can, even though there was no legal relationship there, we weren't married, that the law provides a relationship. So I can't marry my cohabitee's daughter, you know, that it creates.
And I guess obviously also you can't marry your father's.
Yeah, you can never marry your mother
or aunt, or aunt. That gets a little complicated. So an annulment is saying that the marriage was not valid ever.
From the beginning,
as opposed to a civil divorce, which is taking something that does exist and just getting rid of it.
And even there are some churches that do grant divorces. The Orthodox churches grant ecclesiastical divorces, which is there was a marriage. We're not. I mean, there are some Orthodox churches that do annulments, but it's in a minority. Generally, they just set aside that marriage and apply what they call economia and admit you to a second marriage.
Really?
And which is different in the Catholic Church. In the Orthodox Church.
Okay, not in the Catholic Church or any of the Eastern Catholic churches. Okay, so now I think that people understand why it can be so complicated. So the job that you do at the tribunal, which is annulments mostly, what is that process?
Well, basically, someone would come to us, usually their pastor first, and maybe they want to become Catholic, or maybe they're just in a broken marriage and they want to talk to their pastor. The pastor might refer them to the tribunal for different reasons. Sometimes they want to get remarried. Sometimes they just want closure in their life. And so they would fill out an application and come to the tribunal, and then we would help them prepare a petition, and part of that is collecting evidence then. So we have to interview the parties, the respondent, the ex-spouse has a right to participate, and they might want to, they might not. Sometimes they might be for the nullity, sometimes they might be against the nullity. We have to get witnesses, sometimes we might get documentary proofs. You know, if you say that you were forced into this and there's a newspaper article about it, or were you drunk, and or maybe we might have an expert that we need to use who can comment on your psychic capacity at the time. You know, were you freely doing this, or do you have a psychological disorder? And so we try and gather this all together. And then the parties have a right to view that if they want to make any additional comments. The defender of the bond will look at it. The defender of the bond speaks for the validity of the marriage and will say, well, this is what I see here. I think that, you know, they were 21 years old. They both had PhDs in molecular biology. You know, they seem pretty mature. They said, you know, to the priest that they were intending the right thing. And then the judges will take all of that and try and make a decision.
It sounds, especially in a place like Toronto, so you have to investigate things that happened 30 years ago in El Salvador, and interview people that maybe knew them at the time. How long does this take?
It depends on the case, you know. If everyone's participating, and so even Pope Francis has given us new norms where we can do a brief process, which would take about a month-ish. But that's, again, if both, first it has to be manifestly invalid. So, I mean, if somebody comes to me and says, you know, I was 16 years old, I was pregnant, my parents told me if I don't marry this guy, they're going to shoot me. Unfortunately, it does happen. Then she'll petition. And then if I contact her respondent, this is the tricky part, and he has to also say, oh yeah, that is what happened, I agree.
And the respondent is the person she married?
Yeah, the ex-spouse. Now, in North America, frequently ex-spouses don't want anything to do with us. It's contentious, you know.
Yes.
Sometimes it's not, but a lot of the time it is. And so if they both will participate, and it's very clear, we can get it done very quickly. Yeah, but I'd say those are for a minority of cases where it's very obvious and both will participate.
So the changes that Pope Francis made in October last year during the synod or after the synod, how does it streamline it? Because you still would have to do interviews and
but with that we could just sit down and basically do it in one session and take everything in summary form, and if we can all agree, and then the diocesan bishop himself will judge those cases. Now, I'd say in Toronto, which is the largest tribunal in the country, if we had one of those a month, I think that would be a lot. So there's going to be a minority of cases. The majority of cases are going to be still the old form of going through everything.
So then the changes that Pope Francis made will only affect the easy
really
ones.
Well, sometimes it's so invalid, and you're like, do we really have to go through everything, you know? Saddam Hussein was going to kill my family unless I married this guy, and everyone says it. I mean, do we really have to go through this, you know?
Yeah, okay. It sounds like it's also could be a painful process for a lot of people.
It can be, especially, they have to find witnesses, or sometimes, I mean, the respondent has a right to participate, and that can be challenging if there are abuse questions. Maybe they don't want to contact the respondent, but the position of the church has always been that there are civil means available to protect yourself, and that can be tricky.
Okay, we're going to take a little break. This is very good. We're speaking with Father Alex Laschuk of the Marriage Tribunal of Toronto. We're talking annulments. It's not a long break, so stay tuned. We'll be right back. We're speaking with Father Alex Laschuk of the Marriage Tribunal of the Archdiocese of Toronto. We're speaking annulments. So you just explained the process. It not only sounds like it would take a long time, or it could take a long time, but it also sounds like it would be expensive.
Well, I mean, if you want to have lights on, you got to pay an electricity bill. If you want to send a letter, these files can be thick, you know, you got to photocopy them. We send things out registered mail to know if people got them or not. All of this can add up very quickly. And this is a ministry of the church that's subsidized by the donations of the faithful.
How many people work in the so you said Toronto's the largest tribunal in Canada?
Yeah, and we have 34 employees that
have to get paid.
Yeah, we can't pay them in chickens, I guess, yeah.
Is there a cost? Do you charge?
At the Archdiocese of Toronto, we don't. The Holy Father has been really encouraging us as much as possible to move away from doing this. And the very next day, the Roman Rota, his tribunal, raised their fees.
Right.
But we don't have a fee in Toronto. We have a suggested donation that reflects a cost to the Archdiocese. In my experience, I would say less than half are able to give for whatever reason, and that doesn't impact, it's a donation, just like anything. And so if you can, that's great, and if not. But there are tribunals in the country that do have fees.
Yeah, okay. Now, would you, I don't know if you can, but would you recommend that people, if they think that their marriage was not valid, that they should investigate whether they should get an annulment, or should they only bother if they want to get remarried?
Well, I shouldn't say not just because you want to get remarried. Some people, this can be a very healing process, especially if you've been in a very abusive relationship. For the church to say there was a problem there from the beginning, I think for some people can be a recognition of what they went through. And I'd say the first step is always to talk to your pastor, who hopefully can give you some guidance in what's going on here, and is it worth you going to the tribunal, certainly.
Right, okay. So then after you're done, so the marriage is declared null, is that correct? What is the state of those two people, as if they had never been married?
Their canonical state in the church is that they were not married. Yeah.
Ever.
Yeah. So they might have a restrictive clause. Some people don't always aware of this, but if you had a problem that was, say, psychological, you have some disorder, if you're a schizophrenic maybe, and your understanding of reality is impeded, the judges are going to probably put a prohibition on you getting remarried.
Okay.
And so sometimes, because we're here to speak to help the people of God, but we're also here to protect the sacrament of matrimony.
Okay.
And so we want to make sure that people are entering into valid marriages. So if it's very obvious to me that they're going to notch, then...
But so even if canonically it's as if they were never married, if somebody comes to me and they want to get married and they don't tell me, when I go do all the paperwork, it'll be noted somewhere that they were previously married and that marriage was null.
And the pastor or deacon would call the chancellor usually, who would say, well, they're free to marry, there's a monitum, a warning, just make sure they understand this, or there's a prohibition, they have to go see a counselor or whatever.
So what if they have children.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't make the children illegitimate.
No,
or
certainly,
anything.
yeah. I mean, as long as at least one of the parties entered into it with good faith, it's what we call a putative marriage, which means the children are legitimate. We don't doubt that. I mean, the people entered with good faith. If they both realize this was an immigration marriage, you know, sometimes you get these and there was no intention to ever be in a marriage, then that might be something different. But those are pretty rare. That generally, that we don't get into those questions at all. So even in church history, when we were very strict on legitimacy, like if you were illegitimate, you couldn't be a priest or different things. That never
But that's
impacted.
not the case anymore. So that's not even, you would say that that's not even an issue.
Yeah, it's not
People
even an
shouldn't
issue
even
for us.
question
Yeah.
that. Okay, so that means finding whether a marriage was valid or invalid. Can a marriage be validated after the fact?
Yeah, certainly. Yep.
So two people entered into a marriage for lack of form, let's say they were at City Hall, and then 20 years later, I guess in that case, they would have to get remarried.
They could do two things. Yeah, one would be the validation, so they come to the church, and that might be, you know, a big thing with all their family coming, or it might just be in the sacristy with, you know, the cantor and the reader as witnesses, you know, and that's it.
But they don't have to. I mean, they weren't married in the church, so they would have to be married in the church. But that you said it's a validation.
We call it a validation.
Validation.
Yeah. Sometimes called a convalidation.
Convalidation. So, are there other reasons where two people might want their marriage validated after the fact?
Well, it could be because maybe they weren't able to marry at that time because of an impediment. So if they had a prior bond and now that person's deceased, or they've obtained a declaration of nullity.
Okay.
Or maybe that they were civilly married when he was still a priest and now he's not a priest anymore.
I actually spoke to a couple recently, and they've been married, I don't know how many years, 12 years or something, a long time, and they have a child. They have two children. But the reason why they could not get married in the church or had not been married in the church is because he was going through a horrible divorce situation that dragged on for 10 years. So in the meantime, they got married civilly and they have children. And now that the divorce papers finally went through, because you wouldn't be able to marry them in the church until those divorce,
generally,
even though that marriage was not a Catholic marriage originally, you still have to wait for the civil divorce.
Well, generally, there's a general consensus. I mean, not everywhere, but that we try and avoid getting into things where there's still litigation going, because generally chanceries don't want their records subpoenaed. You know. Yeah.
Okay. So but again, in that case, they're just getting married in the church. They're not validating a marriage.
Well, there's a new marriage from this day, basically.
Yes.
And sometimes that can be tricky because sometimes, you know, one of the spouses might say, "No, we were married 10 years ago. I don't want to do this today."
Okay, but so with validation. So then that it counts as the
That's
new
the
marriage?
beginning of the marriage.
Okay, so can you validate a marriage that, as if it
make it go back to
like that is retroactive? Or something?
So what we could do in those cases, so sometimes maybe one of the parties is against it and we were already married, or maybe one person is aware that there is an impediment or something, but it's not public. You know, they don't want their spouse to know that, you know, there was a prior bond or something like that. So they can approach the local ordinary, the diocesan bishop, and ask for a sanation.
Sanation.
Yeah, so that creates what we call legal fiction, where we basically supply the consent. The consent that's there goes back to the beginning, and so the diocesan bishop will deal with the impediment or whatever.
Okay. So, and you're saying that let's say if the husband does not want to, I'm already married. We got married in City Hall 10 years ago. I don't need to get married again, and she's suffering because now she's really involved in the faith and she can't receive communion. You can validate that marriage without his consent?
Yeah, and sometimes you could do it. So you could ask the ordinary. Now it's gonna be tricky if they're both Catholics, you know. Or else you could even do it if I'm a pastor or a priest and someone comes to me. You could even do it in the internal form through the apostolic penitentiary, that this is a faculty that they have available to them. So sometimes it's done very quietly.
Okay, interesting. And that you're basically, I guess that's a merciful thing to do for this couple, because based on her word, if the marriage might be valid and his consent is still valid, he just doesn't need to know.
It could
that
be
the church
even,
is...
sometimes there's an oops on the part of the priest, and the people might not even know that their marriage has been sanated. Perhaps he forgot to send in the dispensation form and didn't realize till Monday, which meant that that marriage was not valid.
Oh, so even if it's like the Monday after the weekend,
no, I don't
it's still
sleep at
sanation.
the chancery. Yeah, if I don't sleep at the chancery. So if you send it in Friday night at 10 p.m., I'm not getting that till Monday morning, you know?
Oh, okay. Now, when I remember being, studying this in the seminary, and there was a whole thing, Pauline and Petrine privilege, and we never knew which was the difference. And I actually always thought that was sanation. So what's Pauline? So if someone's a Catholic married with a non-Catholic or a non-baptized person.
Basically, if there are two non-baptized persons, in 1 Corinthians 7, we see St. Paul talks about that, if you want to become baptized and your wife won't live with you in peace with the Creator, that you can depart from her and find a new spouse. So basically, the way that's applied in church law is if you're both unbaptized and you fulfill certain criteria, and we have to verify that you're both unbaptized and that with the facts of the marriage, then you can be that natural marriage, which is not sacramental, so it doesn't enjoy a special firmness.
And it wouldn't be valid either because...
Well, it could be if you are two unbaptized persons who got married at City Hall. We recognize that marriage.
As a valid marriage?
As a very valid, but not a sacramental marriage.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
So if we meet the criteria, the diocesan bishop can dissolve that marriage. And so we'll say that this natural marriage, this non-sacramental marriage is broken, and now you're free to marry in the Catholic Church. And so that would be the Pauline privilege. And now if one of the parties is baptized, we can have the privilege of the faith, sometimes called the Petrine privilege, which we have to petition the Holy Father for. And these grew out of, in the 16th century, we had faculties for missionaries that were going into parts of the world where polygamy was practiced,
yes,
different other things. And so we had to create a lot of these norms. And so there still are norms for polygamy, that if you need to regularize a polygamous relationship, because polygamy was practiced, in the Old Testament. So,
yes.
But if they want to become a Christian, a Catholic, they have to pick one of those spouses.
Yes.
But not necessarily the first.
Yes. Okay, now I'm really confused because earlier you said that a reason for invalidity, for an annulment, is lack of form. So if they were both married in City Hall, why would that marriage be considered valid?
Because form only binds Catholics, and we say Orthodox too.
Ah, so form only binds Catholics, lack of form. Okay, so because they were not Catholic...
At the time, they weren't bound to Catholic form. And in fact, before 2006, when Pope Benedict changed this, even if you were a Catholic but did a thing called a formal defection, you weren't bound to Catholic form. And this got really complicated.
Yeah, I'm completely confused at this point in time. This is when you start asking questions.
That's why we do a doctorate in these things,
This is, yeah, exactly. That's why you did it and not me. Okay, so a little complicated maybe, but maybe in summary, because I think that people, this is good news, that some people feel that their hands are tied, that they're in a situation that they can't remedy, it's too complicated. You're saying it's not complicated. You guys at the Marriage Tribunal are nice people. He doesn't bite. There's no charge in Toronto. Even if the places that charge, I would suspect that it's not an unsurmountable cost.
It is a minor proportion of what it probably actually costs. Yeah.
And certainly cheaper than the wedding costs, probably.
And cheaper than divorce too, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's worth, you'd say that it's worth looking at.
Yeah, talk to your pastor.
For healing and definitely if you feel that you're being called to being remarried. Thank you. Thank you. I have so many more questions, but I know we are actually going to do a series of other programs on this, on what makes marriage valid. We're also going to look at the question of what makes a marriage Catholic, because this question of marriage is important, especially so many of you want to get married. And you are married, so you're not just a PhD canon lawyer, you're a Catholic priest, Ukrainian priest who is married, so that your perspective is unique in that sense. Thank you. Thank you. Father Alex Laschuk, Ukrainian priest. He works at the Marriage Tribunal in the Archdiocese of Toronto. We've been talking about annulments. If you have any questions, it is confusing, but feel free to send us your questions. You can always contact I guess it's easy to call the Marriage Tribunal.
Check out our website.
They have a website, which is?
On the Archtoronto website.
Archtoronto, and I presume that do all dioceses have marriage tribunals?
Yeah, they should, and most of them have websites too. But yeah, each bishop is obligated in canon law to have a tribunal. A tribunal,
there you go. So it's easy to contact them, call, go find out. If you don't know, ask your pastor and they'll connect you, or come to talk to your deacon and we'll connect you. And absolutely the tribunal in Toronto is very accessible. So Father Alex Laschuk has been with us. Send us your questions. You can reach out to us via Facebook or Twitter, or you can email me directly, pedro@saltandlighttv.org. Thank you. That's all for tonight. May God continue to bless you and your home.